Hi guys. So I have today Nancy Drew, The Hidden Staircase. So last time we were on chapter 11, so I'm just going to read the last bit of that chapter. Nancy took heart. Maybe her father was in the hospital and had not been abducted at all. But a moment later her hopes were again dashed when Harry said, "I told those guys I'd be glad to drive the sick man to the hospital, but one of them turned on me, shook his fist, and yelled, 'You just forget everything that's happened, or it'll be too bad for you and your kids.'" "Oh!" Nancy cried out, and for a second everything seemed to swim before her eyes. She clutched the door handle of the taxi for support. There was no question now but that her father had been drugged and then kidnapped. Now we're on chapter 12, the newspaper clue. Miss Gade grabbed Nancy. Do you feel ill?" the nurse asked quickly. "Oh, I'll be all right," Nancy replied. "This news has been a great shock to me." "Is there any way that I can help you?" the woman questioned. "I'd be very glad to." "Thank you, but I guess not," the young sleuth said. Smiling ruefully, she added, "But I must get busy and do something about this." The nurse suggested that perhaps Mr. Drew was in one of the local hospitals. She gave Nancy the names of the three in town. "I'll get in touch with him at once," the young detective said. "You've been most kind. And there oh, and here comes your train, Miss Gade. Good-bye, and again thanks a million for your help." Harry climbed out of his taxi and went to stand at the platform to signal passengers for his cab. Nancy hurried after him, and before the train came in, asked if he would please give her a description of the two men who had been with her father. Well, both of them were dark and kind of athletic looking, not what I'd call handsome. One of them had an upper tooth missing, and the other fellow, his left ear was kind of crinkled, if you know what I mean. "I understand," said Nancy. "I will give a description of the two men to the police." She went back to the telephone booth and called each of the three hospitals, asking if anyone by the name of Carson Drew had been admitted, or possibly a patient who was not conscious and had no identification. Only Mercy Hospital had a patient who had been unconscious since the day before. He was definitely not Mr. Drew. He was Chinese. Sure, now that her father was being held in some secret hiding place, Nancy went at once to police headquarters and related the taximan's story. Captain Rosalind looked extremely concerned. "This is alarming, Miss Drew," he said, "but I feel sure that we can trace the fellow with the crinkly ear, and we'll make him tell us where your father is. I doubt, though, that there is anything you can do. You'd better leave it to the police." Nancy said nothing. She was reluctant to give up, even trying to do something, but she acquiesced. "In the meantime," said the officer, "I'd advise you to remain at Twin Elms and concentrate on solving the mystery there. From what you tell me about your father, I'm sure he'll be able to get out of the difficulty himself, even before the police find him." Aloud, Nancy promised to stay on call in case Captain Rosalind might need her, but in her own mind the young sleuth determined that if she got any kind of a lead concerning her father, she was most certainly going to follow it up. Nancy left police headquarters and strolled up the street, deep in thought. Instead of things getting better, all my problems seem to be getting worse. Maybe I had better call Hannah. Since she had been a little girl, Nancy had found solace in talking to Hannah Gruen. The housekeeper had always been able to give her such good advice. Nancy went into a drugstore and entered one of the telephone booths. She called the Drew home in River Heights and was pleased when Mrs. Gruen answered. The housekeeper was aghast to learn Nancy's news, but she said she thought Captain Rosalind's advice was sound. "You've given the police the best leads in the world, and I believe that's all you can do." "But wait," the housekeeper said suddenly. "If I were you, Nancy, I'd call up those railroad lawyers and tell them exactly what has happened. Your father's disappearance is directly concerned with that bridge project, I'm sure, and the lawyers may have some ideas about where to find him." "Oh, that's a wonderful suggestion, Hannah," said Nancy. "I will call them right away." But when the young detective phoned the railroad lawyers, she was disappointed to learn that all the men were out to lunch, and none of them would return before 2 o'clock. "Oh, dear," Nancy sighed. "Well, I guess I'd better get a snack while waiting for them to come back. but in her worried state she did not feel like eating. There was a food counter at the rear of the drugstore, and Nancy made her way to it. Perching on a high-backed stool, she read the menu over and over. Nothing appealed to her. When the counterman asked her what she wanted, Nancy said, frankly, she did not know, and that she was not very hungry. "Well, then I recommend our split pea soup," he told her. "It's homemade and it's out of this world." Nancy smiled at him. "I will take your advice and try it." The hot soup was delicious. By the time she had finished it, Nancy's spirits had risen considerably. "And how about some custard pie?" the counterman inquired. "It's just like Mother used to make." "All right," Nancy answered, smiling at the solicitous young man. The pie was ice cold and proved to be delicious. When Nancy finished eating it, she glanced at her wrist watch. It was only 1:30. Seeing a rack of magazines, she decided to while away the time reading in her car. She purchased a magazine of detective stories, one of which proved to be so intriguing that the half hour went by quickly. Promptly at 2 o'clock, Nancy returned to the phone booth and called the officers of the railroad lawyers. The switchboard operator connected her with Mr. Anthony Barradell, and Nancy judged from his voice that he was fairly young. Quickly she told her story. "Mr. Drew being held a prisoner?" Mr. Barradell cried out. "Well, those underhanded property owners are certainly going to go to great lengths to gain a few dollars." "The police are working on the case, but I thought perhaps your firm would like to take a hand also," Nancy told the lawyer. "Oh, we certainly will," the young man replied. "I'll speak to our senior partner about it. I know he will want to start work at once on the case." "Thank you," said Nancy. She gave the address and telephone number of Twin Elms, and asked that the lawyers get in touch with her if there were any news should break. "We'll do that," Mr. Barradell promised. Nancy left the drugstore and walked back to her car. Climbing in, she wondered what her next move ought to be. "One thing is sure," she thought. "Work is the best antidote for worry. I'll get back to Twin Elms and do some more sleuthing there." As she drove along, Nancy reflected about the ghost entering Twin Elms mansion by a subterranean passage. Since she had found no sign of one in any of the outbuildings on the estate, it occurred to her that possibly it led from an obscure cave, either natural or man-made. Such a device would be a clever artifice for an architect to use. Taking a little used road that ran along one side of the estate, Nancy recalled having seen a long grassed-over hillock, which she had assumed to be an old aqueduct. Perhaps this was actually the hidden entrance to Twin Elms. She parked her car at the side of the road and took a flashlight from the glove compartment. In anticipation of finding the answer to the riddle, Nancy crossed the field, and as she came closer to the beginning of a huge mound, she could see that there were stones piled up. Getting closer, she realized that it was indeed the entrance to a rocky cave. "Well, maybe this time I've found it," she thought, hurrying forward. The wind was blowing strongly and tossed her hair about her face. Suddenly a freakish gust swept a newspaper from among the rocks and scattered the pages helter-skelter. Nancy was more excited than ever. The newspaper meant a human being had been there not too long ago. The front page sailed towards her. As she grabbed it up, she saw to her complete astonishment that the paper was a copy of the River Heights Gazette. The date was the Tuesday before. "Someone interested in River Heights has been here very recently," the young sleuth said to herself excitedly. Who was the person? Her father? Gomber? Who? Wondering if the paper might contain any clue, Nancy dashed around to pick up all the sheets. As she spread them out on the ground, she noticed a hole in the page where classified ads appeared. "This may be a very good clue," Nancy thought. "As soon as I get back to the house, I'll call Hannah and have her look up Tuesday's paper to see what was in the ad." It suddenly occurred to Nancy that the person who had brought the paper to the cave might be inside at this very moment. She must watch her step. He might prove to be an enemy. "This may be where Dad is being held a prisoner," Nancy thought wildly, flashlight in hand and her eyes darting intently about. Nancy proceeded cautiously into the cave. 5 feet, 10. She saw no one. 15 more. 20. Then Nancy met a dead end. The empty cave was almost completely round and had no other opening. "Oh dear, another failure," Nancy told herself disappointedly as she retraced her steps. "My only hope now is to learn something important from the ad in the newspaper." Nancy walked back across the field. Her eyes were down, and she automatically looked for footprints, but presently she looked up and stared in disbelief. A man was standing alongside her car examining it. His back was half turned toward Nancy, so she could not see his face very well, but he had an athletic build and his left ear was definitely crinkly. Interesting. So now we're on Chapter 13, The Crash. The stranger inspecting Nancy's car must have heard her coming. Without turning around, he dodged back of the automobile and started off across the field in the opposite direction. He certainly acts suspiciously. He must be the man with the crinkly ear who helped abduct my father, Nancy thought excitedly. Quickly she crossed the road and ran after him as fast as she could, hoping to overtake him. But the man had a good head start. Also, his stride was longer than Nancy's and he could cover more ground in the same amount of time. The far corner of the irregular-shaped field ended at the road on which Riverview Manor stood. When Nancy reached the highway she was just in time to see the stranger leap into a parked car and drive off. The young detective was exasperated. She had only had a glimpse of the man's profile. If only she could have seen him full face or caught the license number of the car. "I wonder if he's the one who dropped the newspaper," she asked herself. "Maybe he's from River Heights." She surmised that the man himself was not one of the property owners, but he might have been hired by Willie Wharton or one of the owners to help abduct Mr. Drew. "I'd better hurry to a phone and report this," Nancy thought. She ran all the way back across the field, stepped into her own car, turned it around, and headed for Twin Elms. When Nancy arrived, she sped to the telephone in the hall and dialed Cliffwood Police Headquarters. In a moment, she was talking to the captain and gave him her latest information. "It certainly looks as if you've picked up a good clue, Miss Drew," the officer remarked. "I'll send out an alarm immediately to have this man picked up." "I suppose there is no news of my father," Nancy said. "I'm afraid not, but a couple of our men talked to the taxi driver, Harry, and he gave us a pretty good description of the man who came along the road while your father was lying unconscious on the grass, the one who offered to take him to the hospital." "What did he look like?" Nancy asked. The officer described the man as being in his early 50s, short and rather heavy-set. He had shifty, pale blue eyes. "Well," Nancy replied, "I can think of several men who would fit that description. Did he have any outstanding characteristics?" Harry didn't notice anything, except that the fellow's hands didn't look as if he did any kind of physical work. The taxi men said they were kind of soft and pudgy. "Well, that eliminates all of the men that I know who are short, heavy-set, and have pale blue eyes. None of them have hands like that." "It'll be a good identifying feature," the police officer remarked. "Well, I guess I'd better get that alarm out." Nancy said goodbye and put down the phone. She waited several seconds for the line to clear and then picked up the instrument again and called Hannah Gruen. Before Nancy lay the sheet of newspaper from which the advertisement had been torn. "The Drew residence," said a voice on the phone. "Hello, Hannah. This is Nancy." "How are you, dear? Any news?" Mrs. Gruen asked quickly. "I haven't found Dad yet," the young detective replied, "and the police haven't either, but I've picked up a couple of clues." Here's a picture. It says, "The whole ceiling crashed down on them." Oh, Jesus. "Tell me about them," the housekeeper requested excitedly. Nancy told her about the man with the crinkly ear and said she was sure that the police would soon capture him. If he'll only talk, we may find out where Dad is being held." "Oh, I hope so." Hannah sighed. "Don't get discouraged, Nancy." At this point Helen came into the hall, and as she passed Nancy on her way to the stairs, smiled at her friend. The young sleuth was about to ask Hannah to get the Tuesday copy of the River Heights Gazette, when she heard a cracking noise overhead. Immediately she decided the ghost might be at work again. "Hannah, I'll call you back later," Nancy said, and put down the phone. She had no sooner done this than Helen screamed, "Nancy, run! Nancy, the ceiling!" She herself started running for the front door. Nancy, looking up, saw a tremendous crack in the ceiling just above the girls' heads. The next instant the whole ceiling crashed down on them. They were thrown to the floor. "Oh!" Helen moaned. She was covered with lath and plaster and had been hit hard on the head, but she managed to call out from under the debris, "Nancy, are you all right?" There was no answer. The tremendous noise had brought Miss Flora and Aunt Rosemary on a run from the kitchen. They stared in horror at the scene before them. Nancy lay unconscious, and Helen seemed too dazed to move. "Oh my! Oh my!" Miss Flora exclaimed. She and Aunt Rosemary began stepping over the lath and plaster, which by now had filled the air with dust. They sneezed again and again, but made their way forward nonetheless. Miss Flora, reaching Helen's side, started pulling aside chunks of broken plaster and lath. Finally she helped her great-granddaughter to her feet. "Oh, my dear, you're hurt," she said solicitously. "Oh, I'll be all right in a minute," Helen insisted, choking with the dust. "But, Nancy—" Aunt Rosemary had already reached the unconscious girl. With lightning speed she threw aside the debris which almost covered Nancy. Whipping a handkerchief from her pocket, she gently laid it over Nancy's face so that she would not breathe in any more of the dust. "Helen, do you feel strong enough to help me carry Nancy into the library?" she asked. "I'd like to lay her out on the couch there." "Oh, yes, Aunt Rosemary. Do you think Nancy is badly hurt?" she asked worriedly. "Oh, I hope not." At this moment Nancy stirred. Then her arm moved upward and she pulled the handkerchief from her face. She blinked several times as if unable to recall where she was. "Oh, you'll be all right, Nancy," said Aunt Rosemary kindly. "But I don't want you to breathe this dust. Please keep the handkerchief over your nose." She took it from Nancy's hand and once more laid it across the girl's nostrils and mouth. In a moment Nancy smiled wanly. "I remember now. The ceiling fell down." "Yes," said Helen. "It knocked you out for a few minutes, and I hope you're not hurt." Miss Flora, who was still sneezing violently, insisted that they all get out of the dust at once. She began stepping across the piles of debris with Helen helping her. When they reached the library door, the elderly woman went inside. Helen returned to help Nancy, but by this time her friend was standing up, leaning on Aunt Rosemary's arm. She was able to make her way across the hall to the library. Aunt Rosemary suggested calling a doctor, but Nancy said this would not be necessary. "Oh, I'm so thankful that you girls weren't seriously hurt," said Miss Flora. "What a dreadful thing this is. Do you think the ghost is responsible?" Her daughter replied at once, "No, I don't. Mother, you will recall that for some time we have had a leak in the hall whenever it rained, and the last time we had a storm, the entire ceiling was soaked. I think that weakened the plaster, and it fell of its own accord." Miss Flora remarked that a new ceiling would be a heavy expense for them. "Oh dear, more troubles all the time, but I still don't want to part with my home." Nancy, whose faculties by now were completely restored, said with a hint of a smile, "Well, there's one worry you might not have any more, Miss Flora." "What's that?" "Mr. Gomber," said Nancy, "may not be so interested in buying this property when he sees what has happened." "Oh, I don't know," Aunt Rosemary spoke up. "He's pretty persistent." Nancy said she felt all right now, and suggested that she and Helen start cleaning up the hall. Miss Flora would not hear of it. "Rosemary and I are going to help," she said determinedly. Cartons were brought from the cellar, and one after the other were filled with debris. After all of it had been carried outside, mops and dust cloths were brought into use. Within an hour, all of the gritty plastered dust had been removed. The weary workers had just finished their job when the telephone rang. Nancy, being closest to the instrument, answered it. Hannah Gruen was calling. "Nancy, what happened?" she asked. "I've been waiting over an hour for you to call me back. What's the matter?" Nancy gave her all of the details. "What's going to happen to you next?" the housekeeper exclaimed. The young sleuth laughed. "Something good, I hope." She asked Nancy to look for her copy of the River Heights Gazette of the Tuesday before. In a few minutes the housekeeper brought it to the phone, and Nancy asked her to turn to page 14. "That has the classified ads," she said. "Now, tell me what the ad is right in the center of the page." "Do you mean the one about the used cars?" "That must be it," Nancy replied. "That's not in my paper." Hannah Gruen said it was an ad for Aikens, a used car dealer. He's at 24 Main Street in Hancock. "And now turn the page and tell me what ad is on the back of it," Nancy requested. "It's a story about a school picnic," Hannah told her. "Does either of them help you?" "Yes, Hannah, I believe you've given me just the information that I wanted. This may prove to be valuable. Thanks a lot." After Nancy had finished the call, she started to dial police headquarters, then changed her mind. The ghost might be hiding somewhere in the house to listen, or, if he had installed microphones at various points, any conversations could be picked up and recorded on a machine a distance away. "It would be wiser for me to discuss the whole matter in person with the police, I'm sure," Nancy decided. Divulging her destination only to Helen, she told the others that she was going to drive downtown but would not be gone long. "You're sure you feel able?" Aunt Rosemary asked her. "Oh, I'm perfectly fine," Nancy insisted. She set off in the convertible, hopeful that through the clue of the used car dealer, the police might be able to pick up the name of one of the suspects. "They can track him down, and through that man, locate my father." So that's the end of that chapter. And the next one is chapter 14, An Urgent Message. But I won't be reading that one until next time. That's all for today. Hope you guys liked it. Bye.